Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, Canadians were shocked and saddened to learn of the horrific anti-Semitic attack in Pittsburgh. On behalf of the official opposition, I'd like to extend our thoughts and our prayers to the victims, their families, and to the entire Jewish community. These kinds of hateful acts must be condemned in the strongest terms possible. Can the Prime Minister update this House on the government's response and tell us what specific measures they are taking in order to stop anti-Semitism and to ensure the safety of synagogues across Canada? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Speaker, Canadians are horrified by the anti-Semitic attack at a synagogue in Pittsburgh on Saturday. Our hearts are with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh and across Canada. May the families of those murdered be comforted, and may the injured recover quickly and fully. We're working with U.S. authorities and are ready to assist if required. Mr. Speaker, we will always stand united against hatred, intolerance, anti-Semitism, and violence.
Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there were disturbing reports this weekend that Stats Canada has informed banks and credit card companies that it expects them to hand over personal financial data of at least 500,000 Canadians without their knowledge or consent. Even worse, banks won't be allowed to inform their customers that the government is following every single one of their transactions. With a long history of government privacy breaches, Canadians are rightly worried. Why are the Liberals collecting the personal data of Canadians without telling them?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government is ensuring that the personal data of Canadians are protected. Statistics Canada will use the anonymized data for statistical purposes only. No personal information will be made public. I understand Statistics Canada is actively engaged with the Privacy Commissioner's office on this project and is working with them to ensure Canadians' banking information remains protected and private. High-quality and timely data are critical to ensuring the government programs remain relevant and effective for Canadians.
Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government plans to access the personal financial information of Canadians without their knowledge or consent. Personal information like bill payments, online purchases, credit card transactions, cash withdrawals and deposits, even e-transfers between family members, and the list goes on. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing and immediately assure Canadians that this intrusion into their lives will be stopped?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians rightly expect that government agencies and groups like Statistics Canada work with the Privacy Commissioner to ensure that their private lives are protected. But, Mr. Speaker, need I remind you and all Canadians that it was the Conservative government that chose to stop the long-form census, to cancel the long-form census as a way of protecting people's private information. What that led to was more policy based on ideology and less policy based on evidence like we are doing now. Their attacks on data and information continue.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, citizens expect the government to protect their information, and yet the Liberals want to have access to confidential data of 500,000 Canadians without their consent. Bill payments, ATM withdrawals, credit card payments, bank transfers, account balances, and even social insurance numbers. How can the Prime Minister justify this action that clearly violates Canadians' privacy? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will always ensure that Canadians' personal data is protected. Statistics Canada uses this anonymous data for statistical ends only. No personal information will be made public. I am told that Statistics Canada is working with the Privacy Commission on this project, and they are working together to ensure that Canadians' data remains protected and private. Getting high-quality data is essential to allow the government's programs to remain relevant and effective for all Canadians. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, allow me to read Section 5 of the Personal Information Protection Act. A government institution shall inform any individual from whom the institution collects personal information about the individual. And Mr. Speaker, Canadians' personal information belongs to them. It is simply unacceptable that the government would obtain this data without their consent. Will the Prime Minister go back on this decision and stop this approach? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are trying to create fear, but I can confirm that Statistics Canada is working with the Privacy Commissioner, as is expected. Once again, we've seen that the Conservatives are attacking data. They're attacking information. This is the same party that cancelled the long-form census. And they are resuming their attacks on data and on facts rather than on ideology, Mr. Speaker. That's disappointing. And it's disappointing to see once again that they haven't learned their lesson. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Lévesque.
Mr. Speaker, Saturday's shooting at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue was an appalling act of anti-Semitism. The hearts and prayers of all New Democrats go to the victims, their families, and to Pittsburgh's Jewish community. However, this senseless attack is merely the latest episode in a series of crimes inspired by hate and prejudice, such as anti-Semitism, of course, but also Islamophobia and homophobia. Canadians are rightly concerned by the rise of violence and bigotry. Could the Prime Minister inform this House of the measures his government intends to implement to tackle all these forms of extremism?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are horrified by the anti-Semitic attack that happened on Saturday in a Pittsburgh synagogue. We stand side by side with members of the Pittsburgh Jewish community and the community in Canada. We hope that their families will find solace and wish that the injured will make a full recovery. We are working with American authorities and will help where necessary. We will remain standing in solidarity against anti-Semitism and violence all around the world. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Lévesque. Mr. Speaker, the riding of Outremont has not had a Member of Parliament for over 2 months. The ridings of Burnaby South and York Simcoe have not been represented in this House for over 1 month. And yet the Prime Minister is only calling one by-election in Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes. And that's because he had no choice. This is only the second time in 20 years that a Prime Minister has called a by-election while leaving other ridings vacant. What political calculus has led the Prime Minister to deprive over 300,000 people of representation in this House? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I was proud to announce that the by-election in Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes will be happening on December 3rd, 2018. By-elections will be announced for more recent departures in accordance with the Canada Elections Act.
Mr. Burnaby.
What a weak and insipid response. The people in these ridings deserve better, Mr. Speaker. 300,000 Canadians are being denied their right to representation in Parliament. There is simply no excuse for this kind of petty manipulation. Now, the Prime Minister recognized that last year when he called the by-elections and didn't play with the dates. Canadians living in Burnaby South and Outremont and York Simcoe have the right to make their voices heard. Why is the Prime Minister denying the rights of these Canadians to elect their representatives?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it has been mere weeks since those seats were vacated. We will call those elections in due course, as is required under the Elections Act.
New Westminster Burnaby, order.
Mr. Speaker, these by-elections don't belong to the Prime Minister. They don't belong to me. They don't belong to anyone in the House. They belong to the people of Burnaby South and York Simcoe and Outremont, and these citizens have the right to choose their representatives now. We're living through the worst housing, environmental and family debt crisis in our nation's history. And the people of these ridings have the right to judge the government in all of these cases. And isn't that the real reason for this petty act? The Prime Minister is scared of the reaction of the voters. Will he show some courage and call the by-elections now?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, it has been mere weeks since those particular seats were vacated. The questions might be asked, Mr. Speaker, about the fact that electors elected people to serve 4 terms for them and didn't get to have that whole 4 terms that they elected of people they sent to this House for various reasons, which is their choice. But the sanctimony from the NDP on this is, as always, amusing. Those seats were vacated mere weeks ago. They will be filled under elections law in due course through a by-elections.
Order. The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Halloween must be here, but it's a trick. There's no treat from this minister. She promised that her carbon tax will reduce emissions and leave Canadians better off. Canadians won't be tricked by an election gimmick. Canadians know that Liberals can't be trusted to keep their promises. When will the Liberals acknowledge that this carbon tax will do nothing for the environment but leave Canadians worse off?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we were elected on a commitment to grow the economy, support the middle class, and protect the environment at the same time. We are moving forward with a plan to put a price on pollution, which I note even Stephen Harper's former Director of Policy has indicated will leave families better off, and that was confirmed when the Prime Minister made the announcement just last week. Mr. Speaker, I know we're in the spirit of Halloween jokes, and no matter how much the opposition wants to dress up like defenders of the middle class, Canadians won't be tricked.
Honourable member for Abbotsford. Order.
See, Mr. Speaker, more tricks from the Liberals. The Prime Minister has told Canadians that it's a good thing for gasoline prices to go up. He actually said that. But he doesn't want you to worry about carbon taxes. He claims that raising taxes on Canadians leaves us all better off. Usually when a stranger tells you to send them money and promises that you'll get even more back, you know it's an email scam. When will this tax-raising, deficit-running Liberal government stop trying to trick Canadians into believing that higher taxes will leave them better off?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, if we actually look at the facts, if you look at the numbers from last week's announcement, we can actually confirm that middle-class families can expect to be better off in every jurisdiction where the federal backstop applies. The reason for this is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Businesses and industry are paying into this fund as well, and the rebate's going to go to Canadian families. They're going to have more money to deal with the cost of living, and no matter how much the opposition raises concern about this, we can't mask the fact that families will be better off.
Yes.
Order. I would encourage the honourable members for Richmond Centre and Edmonton Manning not to interrupt when someone else has the floor. The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member now claims that businesses will pay into this fund, but we all know that large industrial emitters actually get an exemption from the carbon tax. And when I asked last week of the Environment Minister why this was, she said that it was because it was necessary to exempt them in order to keep good jobs here in Canada, which confirms that a full carbon tax applied to a business would drive jobs out of Canada, which of course begs the question, if carbon taxes drive jobs out of the country, why is this government imposing that same tax on our small businesses?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take the question. We have lowered the small business tax rate for small businesses in Canada, and we set aside $1.4 billion for small businesses in jurisdictions where the federal backstop applies. But, Mr. Speaker, I've been watching members on the opposite side of this House distort the facts for weeks. The fact is, big emitters are going to pay under our plan. No ifs, ands, or buts. That is an important part of the feature of our plan. Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward with a plan that's going to actually protect competitiveness, and it's extremely hypocritical for the honourable member to suggest we're not charging big emitters enough when his plan is to make sure they don't pay at all.
Right.
Honourable order. The honourable member for Carleton.
Actually, their own documents show that large industrial emitters get a 90% exemption from this carbon tax. All we're asking for is that small businesses get exempt from the tax as well. So far, the government has not yet explained why the local corner store, a small construction company, a landscaper, or others of the thousands of companies that create the majority of jobs in this country have to pay taxes on their fuel when large industrial emitters get an exemption. So, why?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to small businesses, we're taking an approach of seeing their tax burden actually come down on the whole, and we're also setting aside funds, $1.4 billion in jurisdiction where the federal backstop applies, to help small businesses reduce their cost of consumption by greening their operations and dealing with the day-to-day cost of business. When it comes to big industrial emitters in trade-exposed industries, to avoid having a mechanism like we've put in place, we could potentially have jobs leaves and we'll do nothing for emissions. The plan we're putting in place mirrors what we've seen in California, in Quebec, in Alberta, and the European Union, that allows economies to grow, jobs to stay in Canada, emission comes down. This is the responsible path forward, and it's time they get on board.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, now the admission is even more explicit. He said that if the large emitters had to pay the same carbon tax as everyone else, the jobs would leave the country and it would do nothing for emissions. That's exactly what we've been saying about the carbon tax all along. Raise the cost of doing business here in environmentally friendly Canada and drive jobs to places with lower environmental standards. That would drive up pollution worldwide and unemployment here at home. When will the government listen to its own rhetoric on the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, pleased to take the question. The justification he just put forward, the assumption under his question, is the explicit reason why there is an output-based pricing system. The point is to keep jobs in Canada so that emitters don't pollute elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, we're moving forward with a plan that's actually going to help improve our environmental record, help create jobs in Canada. So far, our plan is working, Mr. Speaker. We have seen the economy add over 500,000 jobs since the last election. Unemployment is at the lowest rate virtually since we started keeping statistics, and emissions are coming down. Mr. Speaker, no matter how much they cry foul, when they know this is the right path forward, we will not be disturbed. We will move forward with a response.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Well, they should be disturbed by their own answer, Mr. Speaker, because they're now admitting what we've said all along, that if the carbon tax is applied, it will drive business and jobs out of the country into places with poorer environmental standards where global emissions will actually go up. They've just admitted it now 3 times in the House of Commons. That is their justification for giving large industrial emitters an exemption. So, simple question, will they give the same exemption to our small business shop leaders?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I've now dealt with the same question a number of times in a row and given an explanation that I'm completely satisfied with. But, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that he's had a number of faulty assumptions underlying the questions he's asked already, the thing that I haven't seen in any one of his questions was the suggestions that the Conservatives have any kind of a plan at all. For 10 years, they had no plan to deal with emissions, and they failed on the environment. For 10 years, they had no plan for the economy and saw the worst record of growth since the Great Depression. Mr. Speaker, where the Conservatives failed twice, we will succeed. We are moving forward with a plan that's helping grow the economy, protect the environment, and we know we're on the right track.
The Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Prime Minister said he's suspending further arms export permits to Saudi Arabia and reviewing existing ones. What merits reviewing, Mr. Speaker? Canadians want to know. Because they do know that Saudi Arabia crushes dissidents and has been accused of war crimes in Yemen. They know that Jamal Khashoggi is only the latest in a horrific series of abuses. Canadians don't want to be complicit with these atrocities. Will this government guarantee no more Canadian arms will reach Saudi Arabia?
Parliamentary Secretary for Consular Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we condemn the horrible murder of Jamal Khashoggi and are deeply concerned by reports on the participation of Saudi officials. We strongly demand and expect that Canadian armed exports are used in a way that fully respects human rights. That's why our government is committed to a stronger and more rigorous arms export system, and of course it's why we acceded to the Arms Trade Treaty. As the Prime Minister said, we are actively reviewing existing export permits to Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Expect that the arms won't be misused. It's necessary to ensure they won't be misused.
Mr. Speaker, the war in Yemen has created the worst humanitarian catastrophe on the planet, not to mention the Saudi regime's treatment of women, dissidents, and minorities. We already know that they have used Canadian arms in their against the civilian population, and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is just one more item on that horrible list. So what is the Prime Minister waiting for to suspend not just future permits, but current permits as well?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we are working with our allies to consider options. We are currently reviewing the arms permits to export permits to Saudi Arabia. All permits need to respect the criteria laid out. We have revoked permits in the past, and we will not hesitate to do it again. Honourable Member for Provencher.
Transfer is a family-owned trucking company that serves southeastern Manitoba. The Liberal carbon tax is going to hit them hard. Margins are already thin, and another tax will add to their burden and increase costs for their customers. Last week, the Environment Minister admitted that she gave major exemptions to large companies to avoid significant job losses. Will the Liberals give the same exemption to smaller companies like Landmark Transfer to ensure that jobs aren't lost there either?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, our government was elected on a commitment to protect the environment and grow the economy at the same time. We are moving forward with part of our plan to protect the environment by ensuring that pollution is not free. We are putting a price on pollution that's going to be paid by big polluters as well as others. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, we're ensuring that a rebate accrues to families so middle-class families are left better off. Mr. Speaker, I point the honourable member to the statement of Mark Cameron, Stephen Harper's former Director of Policy. If he doesn't believe me, he can look to his own side to demonstrate that families will be made better off as a result of the plan we're putting in place. Mr. Speaker, we're moving forward with a plan that's making life more expensive.
Honourable Member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Mr. Speaker, I recently travelled to New Brunswick, where I heard significant opposition to the Liberals' new carbon tax. Beef and dairy farmers, as well as apple growers, are all concerned that the Prime Minister's carbon tax will drastically increase their production costs. Farmers, families and seniors are worried that this cash grab will make the cost of everything more expensive. Mr. Speaker, when will the Liberals admit that their carbon tax is nothing more than an election gimmick and a new source of revenue to feed this Prime Minister's irresponsible and out-of-control spending problem?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We campaign on a promise that we will grow our economy and protect the environment at the same time, and that's exactly what we are doing. We know that Canadian farmers are responsible stewards of the land, and that's why we exempted on-farm fuel and gasoline under the federal backstop. We also provided additional relief for greenhouse farmers and provide for small and rural communities. Mr. Speaker, we have and will continue to support our farmers in this country. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, life is very expensive in Northern Canada, and they simply don't have an option to hop on the O train or the Canada line. The cost of housing, the cost of infrastructure, the cost of food, heating their homes in the winter is extraordinarily expensive.
Exactly.
200 communities have diesel only, so their little 10% rural addition is nothing. What are they going to do? Why are they imposing a tax on Northerners that is going to do nothing but make life more expensive?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I grew up as part of a generation where caring about the environment was part of lessons from my first day in elementary school. I'm so proud to be part of a government that's actually putting in place a plan to protect the environment. Mr. Speaker, our plan involves putting a price on pollution. We're going to make life more affordable for Canadians but more expensive for polluters. To the member, I'd say her constituents who are living in rural areas are actually going to receive a top-up, and I don't know why she's committed to campaigning on a promise on taking money out of her constituents' pockets so she can make life more affordable for polluters instead of Canadians.
Honourable Member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that climate change needs to be addressed, but this government has not shown Canadians how the carbon tax will reduce emissions. China produces 26% of all emissions, while the U.S. produces over 15%, but Canada produces less than 1.5%. Yet we have a punishing tax that limits our competitiveness. Canadians are willing to do our part to address climate change, but why is the Prime Minister putting Canadian businesses and and our economy at risk for a carbon tax that won't even lower emissions.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member honestly believes that all members of this House on that side believe this is a threat that needs to be challenged, I suggest she hasn't been with them quite long enough. Mr. Speaker, the reality is we were elected on a campaign commitment to protect the environment and grow the economy at the same time. Our plan to protect the environment ensures we're going to put a price on pollution, and we're going to make sure that middle-class families are left better off. Mr. Speaker, this is not a difficult concept. We are going to make sure that life is made more affordable for Canadians and more expensive for polluters, and I'd suggest that anybody who wants to join us for the next campaign that believes this message would be welcome on this side of the House.
The honourable member for Windsor West.
While the Prime Minister continues to celebrate the USMCA deal, Trump's unjustified tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum are having devastating impact for families in Canada. Canadian workers throughout the country are losing their livelihoods. In fact, workers at Sault Ste. Marie's Tenaris were immediately laid off after the U.S. implemented the tariffs. It's clear the Liberals never should have signed a deal without getting rid of these tariffs first, let alone for the Prime Minister to take a victory lap on the very backs of workers. Now that Mexico is demanding this fix, showing resolve and respect for their workers, will this government do at least the same for ours?
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been absolutely clear when it comes to defending the steel and aluminum workers right across Canada. That is why we put forward measures, $2 billion worth of support for the steel and aluminum sector, $1.7 billion for additional financing through Business Development Canada and Export Development Canada as well, to make sure that they have the resources to succeed going forward. Just a few days ago, we also announced a $50 million investment in ArcelorMittal Dofasco to make sure that they can upgrade their plant. And you know what they're doing? They had a job fair a few days ago for more jobs in the steel sector.
Honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we should stick to the subject. Many steelworkers are here today to get the answers on the unfair U.S. tariffs. They want their paychecks and livelihoods back. Mexico stood up for their workers in the steel and aluminum industry by refusing to sign the USMCA until Trump's unfair tariffs are gone. And the Liberals, they made a choice to sign a deal without getting assurances the U.S. would remove these unfair tariffs. I asked the Liberals, will they commit to establishing a national tariffs task force and commit not to sign the USMCA until these ridiculous tariffs are gone? Yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we're providing safeguards for the steel and aluminum sector. We're providing directed, targeted support for manufacturers, Canadian manufacturers. We provided a $2 billion support fund, Mr. Speaker, and we're engaging with our American counterparts to make sure we eliminate these unjust and unfair tariffs. We've been absolutely clear when it comes to the steel and aluminum sector. We'll continue to defend their interests. We'll continue to protect Canadian workers from coast to coast to coast.
Honourable member for Newmarket Aurora.
Mr. Speaker, today the Minister for International Trade Diversification announced officially the ratification of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership by Canada.
And diversification inform this House of the benefits this trade agreement will have on Canadian consumers and businesses.
Bravo! Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais...
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague for Newmarket Aurora for his excellent work.
My Conservative colleagues opposite, especially the honourable member for Abbotsford, and senators for helping with the swift ratification of CPTPP. Today, we formally announced that Canada has completed the necessary steps to ratify and implement the deal. This agreement will provide access to over 500 million consumers. We are creating jobs for the middle class. This is a great day for Canada.
The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government is refusing to tell us when exactly Mr. Cudmore received his job offer. He started working for the Office of the Minister of National Defence on January 12, 2016. But there's a process which has to happen first. You can't begin to work in the Office of the Minister of Defense without first getting your security clearance. What we would like to know is when did Mr. Cudmore put in his security clearance application?
Mr. Speaker, as it has been explained in the House on numerous occasions, the matter being raised by the honourable gentleman relates to a matter that is now before the courts. When a matter is before the courts and therefore sub judice, according to the rules of the House, according to learned opinions by people like Peter Van Loan, for example, it is improper to ask questions about an outstanding court case, and it's equally improper for ministers to endeavour to answer those questions.
For Durham.
Mr. Speaker, on November 19, 2015, just days after the Liberal cabinet was sworn in, they tried to stop the contract for the Davie shipyard. Media reports have told us that the President of the Treasury Board and Minister of the Environment were involved in that decision. My question today, was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs involved in cabinet discussions related to shipbuilding?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the honourable gentleman is pursuing a line of questioning which, according to the rules of this House, is inappropriate. And one of the reasons for that, Mr. Speaker, is that criminal prosecutions in this country are handled completely independently of government. They are in hands of the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, that service was created in 2006 by Prime Minister Stephen Harper to ensure independence and impartiality.
Member for Durham.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister doesn't seem to confirm or deny my question in the line of questioning on whether the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs was involved in shipyard decisions, Mr. Speaker. What's interesting, a few months later, in January 2016, the minister signed a conflict of interest screen related to the Irving shipbuilding affair, Mr. Speaker. So that leads me to this question. Was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs involved in discussions related to Irving Shipbuilding just ahead of the imposition of his conflict of interest screen?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, in this line of questioning over the last number of days and weeks, the official opposition has tried to meander around a lot of indirect insinuations and accusations, and that is the very reason, Mr. Speaker, why Peter Van Loan said in this House it is deemed improper for a member in posing a question or a minister in responding to a question to comment on any matter that is sub judice. The point, Mr. Speaker, is to protect the independence of the courts and to avoid these drive-by smears.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to be meandering around these discussions around shipbuilding when a gentleman's life is on the line in terms of his liberty, Mr. Speaker. Vice Admiral Mark Norman is facing trial. The Privy Council investigation confirmed that 73 people were aware of leaks from the Liberal shipbuilding discussions, yet only one is facing trial. If the minister doesn't like these questions, Mr. Speaker, he should stand in this House today and confirm they will waive cabinet confidence and release all documents to Admiral Norman.
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, for a very good reason, we have an independent court system in this country, and it indeed is the envy of the world. The prosecution is in the hands of the Independent Public Prosecution Service, which incidentally was created by Stephen Harper, and the defense is in the hands of very competent defense counsel. They have mature rules of court and statutes to pursue, and the two sides will pursue their interests, and justice will be done, Mr. Speaker.
A member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, Liberals keep bragging about how many children they have pulled out of poverty, but the facts on the ground simply do not support their claim. Statistics show that 1.2 million children live in poverty in Canada. 38% of them are Indigenous children. This is shameful, Mr. Speaker. Grassroots organizations have called out the lack of ambition of this government to take meaningful action. Will the Liberals commit to putting in place a concrete plan to finally eliminate child poverty in Canada?
Bravo. Minister of Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to answer the question because it's at the very core of our mandate as a government. Since 2016, we have put into place the most significant social policy innovation of a generation called the Canada Child Benefit, That benefit, Mr. Speaker, in itself is lifting 300,000 children out of poverty, and there are 200,000 parents at the same time. We just launched the first ever poverty reduction strategy in August of this week, which is going to push even further our efforts to decrease child poverty and everyone's poverty in Canada.
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals cannot prove these numbers, that is, that the Canada Child Benefit has lifted so many children out of poverty. Really? In the last 10 years, the numbers have not changed. 1.2 million children are living in poverty, including 38% First Nations children, 38%. Over 100 organizations deplore the lack of ambition of the Liberals' poverty reduction strategy. When are the Liberals going to set real targets to lift children out of poverty, or will they continue with their half measures? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague for giving me the opportunity to again talk about the Canada Child Benefit. I would like to invite my colleagues from the opposition, including my colleagues from the NDP, to support the Canada Child Benefit, which has stopped sending checks to millionaires' families who don't need them, instead sending these checks to middle-class families, families who are working very hard. I appreciate this debate, and I would be very happy to continue this discussion with my colleagues from the NDP to help further their interest in the Canada Child Benefit. The honourable member. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Border Security is misleading Canadians. Last week, he said that the number of illegal migrants had decreased and that his government had a plan to address the problem. But from January to September of last year, 15,102 persons entered Canada illegally, and from January to September of this year, 15,726 migrants crossed the border. That's 624 more this year compared to last year. Quebecers are not impressed that the Prime Minister is not taking their concerns seriously. He says he has a plan. Where is it? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, our government has a clear plan for border security, and we invested $73 million to improve border security and to increase the processing of asylum seekers' applications. We have decreased the number of irregular arrivals. We are currently looking at other ways our government can make progress towards our targets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. That's exactly what I just said. I've just given facts and numbers from the RCMP. The Liberals don't know what they're saying. Sure, money's being invested, but at in Roxham, there is a camp. Employees are being paid millions of dollars in the last 2 years. Why? They are waiting for people who should not cross the border. If they did their job, these people would not come into Canada. We want to see the plan. The official opposition leader asked for the plan. We want to see that plan. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I can tell everyone in this chamber that we have a plan, a 6-point plan, Mr. Speaker. The numbers are decreasing. And anyone crossing Canada in an irregular way undergo strict security controls, which happen as quickly as possible. The number of applications has gone down over the last year. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan in place. It is working, and we are going to keep on implementing that plan. Thank you.
Bill.
Well, here's the plan, Mr. Speaker. Public accounts show that on top of imposing a carbon tax on Canadians, the Prime Minister has spent at least $50 million of their hard-earned cash on hotel rooms for people who have illegally entered Canada and who are abusing our humanitarian immigration system. When so many Canadians are struggling to make ends meet, the Prime Minister should admit how wrong this is. Why is the Prime Minister putting illegal border crossers up at the Hilton while increasing taxes on struggling Canadians?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Border Security.
The reality is that that government did nothing for 10 years to ensure our security as Canadians along the border. In reality, they cut, Mr. Speaker, $400 million from our border security. We are taking action, Mr. Speaker, with $180 million in investment that will ensure that we have the resources in place to keep our border secure while also providing support to our municipalities who have asked for it, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians expect from us, and that is exactly what we're going to continue to do.
The honourable member for Dorval, Lachine, LaSalle. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the 40th gala of the ADISC. The gala is an exceptional platform for our music artists. We already know that the government has modernized our copyright, broadcast, and telecommunications legislation. The government has done so because it is important that our creators can live off their work. Can the Minister for Canadian Heritage tell us more about our government support to artists in Quebec? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague for her excellent question. Last night we celebrated our Quebec history. We celebrated Harmonium. I was the first minister who was there, and the Prime Minister was there. It shows that we support culture. I would like to congratulate the ADISC, which allows our artists and creators to spread their music and their art around the world, around Canada. I say we'll see you next year.
Mr. Speaker, I was in Calgary with a Conservative leader last week. Oil and gas workers said the Liberal carbon tax and their No More Pipelines Bill C-69 damage all of Canada. The Liberals' layers of new red tape and costs actually helped Donald Trump and Canada's biggest competitor, driving Canadian businesses and jobs into the U.S. Investment leaving Canada because of these Liberals is a crisis, and every dollar not spent in Canada goes to countries with much lower environmental protections. Right. Why are the Liberals helping Donald Trump and harming Canada and Canadian resource jobs?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Bill C-69 better rules will lead to more timely and predictable reviews, encourage further investment in Canada, Mr. Speaker, and in Canada's natural resource sectors. This invests in our people. This is about making sure, Mr. Speaker, that good projects move forward, help grow our economy, but do so in a responsible, environmentally responsible fashion. We will not follow the lead, Mr. Speaker, of the Harper Conservatives, who made Canadians lose trust in the very process.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, after the ADIC ceremony, I'd like the Minister for Heritage to stop sounding like a broken record. I have a question which has nothing to do with Radio-Canada or the Canada Council for the Arts. Our culture and media are threatened by online competitors. The government's response, a report in 2020, legislative delays until 2025. It's too late for thousands of jobs in the media sector. Post-media might go bankrupt. Is the Prime Minister willing to accept that? And if it happens, does he understand that every Ottawa daily will shut down except for Le Droit? The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, when the same question is asked 20 times, yes, the Speaker sounds like a broken record. We are working very hard on this important issue. We've invested $50 million for community papers, $14 million for community papers and radio stations across the country. We've invested in Radio-Canada, and in the 2018 budget, the government said it would create new models to help this sector. My colleague knows that this issue is a priority for us, and we are working hard on it.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's strong, competitive aerospace industry is a major driver of jobs, economic activity, and innovation across the country. It contributes over $13 billion in GDP, 86,000 jobs across 700 businesses, and invests $1.7 billion in the Canadian economy. Companies like Bombardier develop and sell leading-edge aircraft worldwide, employing tens of thousands of middle-class Canadians. Can the Minister update this House on the government's work to drive innovation and keep high-quality aerospace jobs in Canada?
The Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the member for his very thoughtful question and his hard work, because he understands the aerospace sector is truly a point of pride for all Canadians. It benefits every region, and our investment to promote more research and development with Bombardier helped create and maintain 5,000 jobs. And the strategic partnership with Airbus led to the first A220 plane built in Mirabel and the first to be delivered in North America. This is great news for the 86,000 people employed in this sector, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Defence has forgotten that Canada is bordered by three oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. And it seems he's forgotten that the two Canada's Navy ships are out of service. One burned and the Protector is rusted out. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives would have went forward with the Astérix, but where's the Obélix? There's a crying need for our Navy, and it's a matter of national security. What is the Prime Minister waiting for to order the Obélix from Quebec? Shipyard workers are waiting to work, and our Navy needs these ships. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you for the tremendous work that they've done for the Atrix. The Canadian Armed Forces are looking forward to the permanent two joint supply ships that are going to be built, but a second interim supply ship is not required at this time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for La Pointe de l'Île. Mr. Speaker, the government is paying for surveys to learn that its management of the migration, irregular migration file is inappropriate. Rather than spending money on consultations, which are endless, and surveys, the Liberals should take that money and send it to Quebec, which is still waiting for reimbursement. Well then. Will Quebec wait A, a very long time, B, a fairly long time, or C, more or less a long time, before receiving the millions of dollars which it is owed for taking in refugees, asylum seekers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. We are working closely with our provincial counterparts. We will keep on working with the government of Quebec to manage the asylum seekers' files. That's what Canadians are expecting of us. That's what we'll continue to do. And I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the federal government announced it will contribute $1.75 billion towards Calgary's bid for the 2026 Winter Olympic Games. However, this will leave a shortfall of $800 million. A shortfall which the Mayor of Calgary and the province of Alberta have already indicated cannot be covered by their respective governments. Mr. Speaker, with the bid on the verge of collapse, my question is to the Minister of Science and Sport. Will the government increase its share of the funding for this remarkable opportunity for Canada to shine on the world stage? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Calgary is a world-class city, and our government has supported the Calgary 2026 Winter Game bid since day one. While exploring this bid, we clearly maintain we must respect the federal hosting policy for international sporting events, a dollar-for-dollar match in funds. That's why we are committing up to $1.75 billion. We remain optimistic that our ongoing discussions with the city and province will lead to a successful bid.
Good. Honorable Député de Beauce.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Ottawa and the provinces already have many programs, regulations and taxes to reduce greenhouse gases. The Prime Minister recognized last week on the Quebec show Tout le monde en parle that even if Canada stopped all economic activity, it would not make a big difference on climate change. End of quote. So why does he want to impose a new costly carbon tax on businesses and consumers, a tax which will have no impact on climate change? Why? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Ministry of the Environment.
That because Canada is relatively small by world standards that we can't do our part. Mr. Speaker, we need to punch above our weight. We were elected on a commitment to grow the economy and protect the environment at the same time. Part of our plan to protect the environment involves putting a price on pollution, which is the most effective way to bring emissions down. Mr. Speaker, we are moving forward with an ambitious plan that's not only going to protect our environment, but pour more money in the pockets of middle-class families. To all those who are opposed to our plan, I'd ask them to go back to their constituents and explain why in the next election they're going to be campaigning on a commitment to take money from their constituents to make pollution